Thank you, MMA, for having me here. This is an unusual talk for me. Normally, I talk about investing and markets, and there I am very relaxed and I don't really need to think about anything. This is a somewhat different talk, and while the theme is about lessons, my own take is that in any kind of secrets of success story, we forget half of the story, which is, you can call it luck, destiny, karma, God, because a lot of things are, you make it a straight line that this is what I did and this is how it happened, but there is also, you can say, a divine hand, right from the where you are born to the opportunities you get. So it's not all credit to yourself. But of course, it has been an unusual journey because I was born in Lucknow, and both my parents have been academics. They've been professors, as far away from the world of money as you can think. They had no interest in money. I think they didn't even know their salaries. And Lucknow itself was not a business city. There was hardly any business there. There were a couple of public sector companies. Other than that, it was academics, research, government, that sort of city. So it was a good place to grow up in many ways because you had the facilities of a big city, all the bookshops, many bookshops, which I believe is not the norm in many other towns and cities. So many bookshops, flower shows, theaters, all of that. And yet it had a small town warmth. So it was a good place to grow up in. Till class 10, my school was less than half a kilometer away. So you could run there in 3 minutes. So that was also very comfortable. And I grew up, as I said, without any exposure to investing or business. In fact, when I landed up at IIMA, I'll come back to that, I was 19 and I didn't even know what a share was and what debit was, what credit was. I had zero knowledge. So I did my schooling and college in Lucknow. Then, in fact, I had gone to Delhi to do my undergrad. I spent one term there doing English honors. So I was always clearer what I didn't want to do. So after class 12, I was the only person in my maths class who did not appear for engineering entrance exams. So, and even though I had never lost a mark in maths in 11th and 12th, all test exams, I had 100 on 100, but I said, I'm clear I don't want to become an engineer. So I actually went to do English honors. But I did not understand the Delhi University system where honors literally meant that you were studying only one subject. So after 3 months there, when I came home after the first term for my Dashera vacation, and I was telling my parents that this is the system there, and my father said that this week are the last admissions for the Lucknow University, so you can still get admitted here if you want. So that's what I did, and I took a very unusual combination. Those days in Lucknow University, you could take any 3 subjects. So I took maths, statistics, and English, which I was the only one in the university with this combination, but it was allowed and I took it. And looking back, I think these are all good building blocks to have in whatever you do in life. If you know maths, statistics, and English, those are the building blocks for anything. And then, of course, I went to IIM. I was 19. I was the youngest in my batch. And as I said, I didn't have any idea about any of what was taught there in the 2 years. I think there was only half of one course in statistics in the second year where I had some background. But I am a learning junkie. I love learning. So I loved those 2 years in terms of how much I could learn about diverse things. And again, at the end of it, I did not have that much idea about where to work, what to do. And again, by process of elimination, I applied to banks and consultancies. So, the point I'm also making is that it's not as if that you know in advance what the path of your life will be. And I joined Citibank. At that time, it was considered the #1 job, and I joined that. I was in investment banking and then in corporate risk. But I was not a very happy employee because I think the culture didn't suit me. So it was a very political, very internally competitive place which did not suit me, because I am pretty much what you see is what you get kind of person. And So, I mean, I can say I didn't want to play games, but fact is I can't play games. I'm not capable of playing games. So I was looking, but again, I was looking for something interesting to do. So you'd be surprised, I even went and met the museum director in Bombay, that what's the interesting career one can have. I went and met the Economic Times editor, what's the interesting thing one can do. So I was searching. And then, of course, liberalization happened, and Dr. Manmohan Singh, in his budget, said that they would open the market to foreign institutional investors. So prior to that, foreigners were not allowed to invest in India. So that was a change. And I said, now the market will professionalize, because till then there was no professional securities research. We did not even have a course on securities research in IMA, because that career did not exist in India. And the brokers were only traditional brokers, and broking was not even considered a very respectable profession overall. So that was, so this was one development was this, and as I said, I was searching. The other was, at that time, SEBI was not there, National Stock Exchange was not there. The older people here would remember that there used to be so many regional stock exchanges, and of which Bombay Stock Exchange was the largest. And they advertised, Bombay Stock Exchange advertised that we'll give 71 new memberships to professionals, and at 55 lakhs. Now, 55 lakhs in the early 90s was a huge amount, but it was a quarter of the market price. The market price of a BSE card, as it used to be called, was 2 crores. So people told me, don't even apply, because I said there was no regulator. BSE was a brokers club. They said it is 80% Gujarati, 20% Marwadi. You are an outsider. You don't fit in anywhere. You don't know anybody. Plus you are a woman. I know people who didn't apply, saying, you know, I'll never get it, because they are going to give it to their nephews and brothers and all that. Why would they give it to you? So, I mean, there's this talk of manifestation and visualization of goals. And to my mind, that was the biggest example that it works, because at that time it was like BSE card is up there. If I get it, you know, the life is set, and there was not very great probability, if you looked at it logically, of getting it. So they tried their best not to give it. And long story short, I mean, there was whatever was subjective, they tried to give minimum marks in that and all that. But in the end, I got 2 extra marks for my IMA gold medal. I didn't even know that in their marking system they had this, that if you are a CA ranker or a gold medalist, you get 2 extra marks. And that pushed me over the cutoff. So in that list of 71 new members, I think I was 69 or something, but that was not a list I needed to top. I needed to be there. So that was one big thing. At that time, corporate memberships were also not allowed. Broker meant it had to be a proprietorship or a partnership. So this was like a proprietorship card. Only later, when SEBI came, NSE came, then corporate memberships were allowed. And of course, NSE came, so became members of that also. And then started, the business was mainly as broker to foreign institutional investors. So all the large funds in the world that came in, we became brokers to that. And really the powerhouse for that was the research. And when the FIIs came, the foreign brokers also came. So all the big names in the world, Morgan Stanley, Merrill Lynch, Jardine Fleming, all these set up broking houses also. And in the beginning, I thought, you know, these guys have been doing it 50 years, 100 years. I must learn from them. So I saw the first few reports of theirs, and I said, this is junk. You know, this is not good analysis. This is not well written. It is very boringly written. I never looked at competition again. And I went back to what has worked for me all my life, which is first principles thinking. So I said, I have to learn this from first principles. At times, I would ask even clients that, recommend books, where can I learn, because valuation or cash flows or whatever. So from there, I never hired from competition either, which again was a very unusual thing in the industry. Everybody was, was poaching from here and there. But I felt that if I don't like what competition is doing, why would I hire people from there and make them unlearn stuff? So I always hired freshers. So it's difficult to, train freshers, but I thought that, somebody who has learned wrong practices that's a, worst candidate to have. So, I mean, in a sense, I carried my parents' legacy. So on Teachers' Day and Guru Purnima, I get a lot of messages because I trained a lot of people. So it became kind of the institute for equity research, and now my alumni are all over, buy side, sell side. So that was an aside, but we became very big institutional brokers in the 90s. I mean, so much so that by year 2000, I was among India's top taxpayers. That year, I paid more tax than the Bollywood Khans and all that. And and obviously one felt thrilled that in your 30s, you are providing employment, you're paying so much tax. Then in the end of the 90s was kind of the next pivot or change. It was, which was going global. So there were two things. One was the Asian crisis of around 1998, when in 1 year, all these markets, which were not, down and out economies, these were the Asian tigers. They were the fastest growing economies of the world. And then in 1 year, they all lost between 50 to 90% in dollar terms between the currency and the market. And that was an eye-opener that this is the danger of being in a single market. And in Citibank time, I had spent 6 months in Indonesia, so I could actually visualize that, if you were an Indonesian, your 90% of net worth was wiped out in a year. So that was one. The other was simply, as I said, I like learning, and I said, how long am I going to keep doing the same old stocks, the same Bajaj Auto and Infosys and HDFC and BPCL, which is pretty much still the same list. So I said, I want to go global. So now, by this time, of course, as I said, we were dealing mainly with foreign institutional investors, in fact, almost entirely with them. And they become friends. I mean, they're not just clients, so not just the India fund manager. You become friendly with the boss's boss. Many of those people are not even in the business anymore, but they're still your friend. So I went to some of these very heads of very large funds across the globe and said, I want to go global, and what do you think? And they said, add a Thailand or a Philippines. And I said, where's the fun in that and adding small markets? I want to go to the large markets. They said, you are a nobody. Who's going to listen to you and till then there was no concept of offshoring research. So they said, they have all these old firms to go to. I mean, you are not even physically there and you want to do this, nobody will listen to you. And they said that if you want to do it, do the small stocks there, the stocks which don't have coverage or have very little coverage. But again, I thought that if I know securities research, why will I not be able to do it? And then I broke it down and I said, why can't I? The data is available. The analyst meets are on the phone. I can join from I or my team can join from anywhere. So why can't I do it? So against all advice, and all precedent, RBI didn't have any policy for a subsidiary in this business. The only financial subsidiaries they had were from banks. So this was a new category they had to create, but we became members of the London Stock Exchange in 1999. So as was said, so we were not just the first Indian, we were the first Asian members other than the Japanese. And then it took another little over a year to get the NASD, which is the US broker-dealer license, because you have to pass certain exams and all that. So all that was done, and then we obviously started to cover global stocks from then. And the most heartening part was that in India, you also know the journalists and the editors personally. There you didn't know anyone. And you were just sending out your work. And in no time, we were in Forbes, Fortune, Business Week, Wall Street Journal, front page, Barron's, everywhere. I still remember I showed my father this thing on Wall Street Journal front page, which said, First Global has come up with this new way of looking at things. And as I said, Papa, I didn't do a doctorate, but, I'm doing some research which is being recognized. And so that was very, very heartening that if you do good work, and again, you drill down, even if you look at a macroeconomic index, if you go into what are the questions in the survey, how is it being marked, you will come up with something other people have not come up with. Even when we started doing macroeconomic research, when we had just started, I didn't even have an economist on board. So I had those regular engineer MBAs and they told me, ma'am, how are you going to do this? I said, the same way you do a company projection, if you break down the GDP to the, as much detail as is available, and then you project every single line, you are projection is going to be better than somebody who's doing it at a, at a high level. So I still remember, and we used to have very provocative covers to our research, didn't want it to become boring. What is now called clickbait, but, said first somebody has to read your report. If you've done great analysis, at least the cover should make them open the report. So our first UK macroeconomic report said that why Bank of England's GDP estimates won't be met, and we had said that there'll be a shortfall, and this is what our estimate is. And when the final numbers came, we were right and Bank of England was wrong, and I was laughing. I said they must have at least 100 economists, if not more, and I had none. So it is just that you have to have that thing inside that I have to go deep into this. I used to tell my analysts that if you can't tell me the derivation of a formula, don't use the formula, because then you don't understand what that formula is actually doing. If you can't tell me the limitations of a model or the assumptions of a model, don't use the model, because then you are building a building where you don't know what's in the foundation. And many times the blow-ups in finance have happened because people have forgotten the assumptions in a model, and they are just, it becomes a complex mathematical exercise where you've forgotten the fundamental. So that was the one. So from 99 onwards, the globalization was one part. Then, but beyond a point, it gets a little frustrating because you are advising funds to do certain things, and they are pulling the trigger. So the fund manager may or may not pull the trigger, even however much you have, however persuasive you have been, and however clear you are in your mind on your analysis. So then the next change was to move from what is called the sell side, which is broking and advising, to actually managing the money. And we started with the global fund management first in 2015. And the portfolio management service, PMS service in India in 2020. Now, the PMS license I had for 20 years before I launched the product, full 20 years. And the reason was that, for me, the benchmark is that can I do a good job of it? And can I do something which is sensible for the client or investor on the other side? Because I always felt that taking someone's hard-earned money is a very big responsibility. And then I can't take the money and just manage it arbitrarily, that I like this stock, I'll buy this stock. So I felt that unless I have some consistency, some ability to predict and foresee what will happen. So that happened with the change to an AI ML system, artificial intelligence machine learning system. And I'm not using artificial intelligence or machine learning because it is available or because it is fashionable. And the reason I'm using it is that there is a fundamental change in investing. It is the kind of change, with a very young audience, I often ask that why is hockey India's national game when we have done nothing in hockey for 50 years? And the answer to that is that we dominated hockey from 1928 to 1970s, and then we kind of went to zero. I mean, dominated to the extent there were 2 Olympics where not one goal was scored against India. We went through the entire Olympics without a goal being scored against us, and then we suddenly went to zero. And what happened? Literally, the playing field changed. From grass, you went to artificial grass or AstroTurf, which meant the skill set required change. You had this, great stick work from Major Dhyan Chand's time, and that became irrelevant. It became how fit you are, how fast you are, which Indians were not that good at. So in investing also, something fundamental has changed. In the 90s, it was, when I started in research, as I said, this was a new field. And no company had an investor relations person, let alone a department. And many conservative companies, especially in Madras, I remember, you would call up and say, I want to come and meet you. They'll say, why would I meet you? You come to our AGM, you see our annual report, and that's all we are willing to share with you. And sometimes I would actually come, and I remember the outskirts of Madras, go to some of these auto ancillaries, for example, and just land up at the factory gate and find out, can I meet somebody? So it was that kind of Wild West. And I always loved going to plants. In Citibank days, I would do plant visits for my colleagues also, because they thought this was like a hassle to take a train to the middle of Andhra to see a cement plant, and I was always eager that let me go and learn something. But now the game has changed, because earlier it was an information arbitrage game, that you have more information than somebody else in the market. But now by law, and this was true not just of India, by US, everywhere, that Fidelity could sit in a room, any large fund basically could sit in a room with the company management and get extra information. But now it's been outlawed everywhere, India, Europe, US, everywhere. So all information by law has to be in the public domain. So even if the company holds an analyst meet, which earlier used to be a closed door meet, the transcript has to be on the website of the company. So now information is available. The skill set has shifted to who can analyze these masses of data. And that's where a machine is much better, both in terms of number of securities it can look at, number of factors per security it can look at, and most of all, eliminating human bias and human error and human randomness. So I am a big fan of, I consider him my guru, one of my all-time favorites, Daniel Kahneman. So he's written these 2 books, Thinking Fast and Slow and Noise, which is precisely about how hard-coded some of these biases are and how hard-coded some of this randomness is. I mean, I can take, for instance, if you take 15 people in insurance or in fund management with exactly the same experience, and you give them a file and ask their, with exactly the same information and ask their view on it, everybody will have a different view. That is human randomness. That's between people. But even the same person, if they have a fight with their spouse or in the traffic, they will look at the data differently. I mean, studies have shown that if you want relief from a judge, if you want bail from a judge, for instance, don't go before lunch, go after lunch. You're more likely to get relief. So that's how random even experienced human beings are. And that's why systems work. So, but ours is not a black box system. It's not that the system, and it is not a trading system. It's an investment system. So every quarter we will run it. We'll see how the ranking of companies is changing, and we can always go back and see which factor has changed for this. And then we have a human intervention. So we say it's a human plus machine system. So humans are required to code it properly, and then humans are required to also analyze the results to an extent. But it forces you to look at data, that you don't overrule systems arbitrarily. So one of the phrases that Daniel Kahneman uses is broken leg analogy, that a system will better predict whether someone will go for a concert, for instance, unless you know for certain that the person has broken their leg and can't go, you should not overrule the system. So that's the thing, that because humans are creatures of the story, so we carry narratives for a long time, and we are unable to change that even when the facts change. So the machine forces you to look at the facts. Machine also is, humans hate to admit mistakes. A machine is indifferent between success and failure. It will adapt and learn from both. So those were some of the things why we changed to a human plus machine system from a human only system. Sometimes people ask me, do quant methods work? And I say, what do you think the models work in Excel, made in Excel, are good or bad? And people will say, it's an absurd question. It depends on what you're putting in the model. I said, it's exactly the same thing with machine learning. It depends on what you're doing with it. It's just a tool. So that has been the journey in terms of changes in business and where I am currently. And I thought the lessons part we can probably, over the discussion, we can come up with what were the lessons and how this was done. So I think I'll come back there.
Thank you, madam. In short, what an inspiring story. One moral of the story is that to measure a GDP, you don't need economists, you need a good mathematician with good knowledge. Very interesting. And now we're going to have leading the conversation. Chandu and Shyam will be leading the conversation with the author. Can I have the AV of Chandu and Shyam, please?
Mr. Chandu Nair is an entrepreneur, advisor, and facilitator working with entrepreneur-led businesses, investors, and social impact ventures with active involvement in funds, cross-border M&A tech deals, and startup ecosystems. Mr. Chandu is an independent director at Shankara Building Products Limited, an executive committee member of the Chennai Angels, and a faculty member at leading business schools. A former co-founder of Scope eKnowledge Center, Mr. Chandu brings deep expertise in KPO, IT-enabled services, business development, and growth advisory. Mr. Shyam Shekhar is the founder and CEO of iThought Financial Consulting LLP and founder and CIO of iThought PMS, overseeing 6 SCBI registered PMS schemes with a combined AUM of 3,400 crore rupees. With over 15 years of experience in investment management, Mr. Shyam leads a research-driven team delivering personalized and innovative investment strategies. Mr. Shyam's mission is to advance financial wellness through education, disciplined investing, and future-focused investment processes.
Gentlemen, that's a profile of our distinguished special invitees who will be leading the conversation. As I mentioned, you have any questions, there's a Mentimeter, QR code is there. Just scan and send you a QR code so that we can take more questions, and otherwise our experience is you will deliver a lecture from Lucknow to Wall Street. We don't want that to happen. Over to you, Chandu, to take the conversation forward.
Shyam, you want to start with because she finished off with investing and a lot of data, etc. D for Devina, and D for data, right?
Yeah, I'll start with a question to which Devina is probably the best person to answer. That is, she's seen equity research in India from the time it started to date. How do you think the equity research of the future is going to be different from the equity research of the past 3 decades? Because 3 decades we have completed in equity research.
Right.
32 years we have done. You've seen it all.
Right.
How do you think the future equity research is going to stand out from the past equity research? That's my first question to you.
Right. So, some of it, what my view was of what research should be today, as I said, the playing field has changed. So you can't play with the old tools. Bon Bock, for instance, still holds a joint record for winning the most number of Wimbledons. But he tried to make a comeback with his old wooden racket and he couldn't go past the first round. And that is what the issue is, that a lot of funds or professionals are still managing money the way it was done in the 90s, whereas the requirement, the skill set requirement has changed. I've even had people on the panel with me, other fund managers, and they said, and they on their unprompted by me said that information arbitrage is gone. And I'm like thinking then are you saying that you are this genius who will always find gems which no one else has found? So that realization that now the skill set is analyzing a lot of data and coming up with insights, which is not a human-only skill. So that part, I think, would change over a period of time. But again, as I said, it's not as if that quant methods are some magic bullet. It depends on how well you are doing it, which is why often systems made by pure techies also don't work, because they don't have market expertise, and now the computing power is not a constraint. So you can analyze thousands of factors. So you might find things which appear to have an impact on market movement, but actually don't cause the market movement at all, because in the world there are many spurious correlations. So you can plot a graph between nuclear energy and cheese consumed, and it can be a correlation of 1, even though one has nothing to do with the other. So we do not even test factors like random factors, that x to the power of y plus square root of z plus this, nothing of that kind, nothing which is not easily explainable. So that's like one of the disciplines that you only test. You have a hypothesis and a factor and you test it. You don't just test anything and everything. So there are many nuances to this, but the short answer is that the skill set required has changed, and therefore research should evolve in that direction.
So what are the kind of skill sets you think, let's say that some students also out here, and there are a lot of people who are very passionate about doing their own research as investors. What's the kind of new skill set that somebody who wants to research businesses and companies should now go after? What is it that one should acquire?
So, of course, you need to know the basics of how to how to crunch the numbers, and one of the things which a lot of people don't do is go beyond the income statement or profit and loss account, because most analysis of companies are, this is what happened to sales, this is what happened to margins, this is how, this much growth, and that's it. Whereas the real story hides in the cash flows, in the ratios, in the balance sheet. And because companies also know that most people will look only at the income statement, they will hide things there. So if a company, for example, is facing a slowdown, what is the first thing they will do? They will go to their buyers and say, take a longer credit period. That instead of 20 days, then pay in 60 days, but buy, so that the sales and profit numbers come, even though the cash is not coming in. So understand that. But the biggest sort of difficult thing to overcome is your own mind, because your mind is not geared to optimize your portfolio. Human brain has evolved for only two things: survival and procreation. And so that's the truth. And so many of the things, for example, there's a loss aversion bias, which is that 1 lakh of loss gives you more pain than the joy you get from 1 lakh of profit. You hate to admit mistakes. You want to be where everybody else is. It's difficult to be out of consensus. So the human brain has many biases. So even if you're doing it for yourself, even if you say that, okay, I don't want a very complex system, these are my 5 ratios, then at least make sure that the portfolio companies you have in your portfolio actually meet those 5 ratios. Because oftentimes people will say, okay, I will buy as per this criteria, this growth rate, this return ratio, whatever. But when you see the actual portfolio, it is something else altogether, because they bought according to what some friend told them, what they heard on television, what was recommended in a Telegram group. So don't play fast and loose with your money. So even if you're doing it yourself, do it with some system and discipline.
You get another D from you, which is discipline. So I have a couple of questions, but I'll lead with the investing one, okay?
Right.
From the things that I read about your investing style, one of the things, you're virtually dissing Warren Buffett. You're saying, look, this narrative business has really not worked. One of the things, and I know you want to be, I'm being provocative here, and I'm trying to do a clickbait out here. So you say that this narrative business has gone on too long, for example, and you point to Warren Buffett and his Coca-Cola thingy, okay? One of the things which comes out for me is a very nice statement I heard about the US diplomat at the height of the Cold War, when he asked his Russian counterpart, that time Soviet counterpart, on what conclusions are you basing your data? Okay. So I just want to ask you, given all this and what you've seen, what are the key fallacies and these kind of errors that you see from this narrative building?
Okay, so there are many of these fallacies that I have dealt with in my book. But where does this come from, this narrative business you are talking about? This is one of the things which is very hard-coded within us, that we are creatures of the story. In fact, this is one thing which is common across all human civilizations, from the absolutely, hunter-gatherer tribes to the most sophisticated, and across time, that we are creatures of the story. We remember stories, we communicate through stories, we teach through stories. Data never moves us the way stories do, which is why all ads are stories. No ads are data. So if I tell you that XYZ district, there are 5 lakh children who are starving, you will turn the page. But if I give you a video or photo of one family which is starving, you are more likely to give money to that charity. So that's how human beings are. So stories are very seductive. So you have to guard against that. Recently, one of the banks we were talking to for distributing our PMS said, which are your high conviction ideas? And we sent them a 3-pager on why we don't have high conviction ideas by design. And, we don't want to have high conviction ideas, because high conviction ideas are what? That you got married to that story. Now you can, so Warren Buffett, as I've written in the book also, I'm not giving him as the worst example. It is just that he's a well-known example, and particularly Coca-Cola is, and I had given that as an example of, that when you tell a story enough times, you also start to believe it. That's the whole thing. Even if you didn't start out believing it, you also start to believe it. So because he said that Coca-Cola, all this great brand, which of course, for the longest time, it was the #1 brand in the world, and and good cash flows, and that's why I bought it. But over 30 years, the stock underperformed the index. It underperformed Pepsi even more. But because you've told that story so many times, you continue to hold it. So it's not like that is the worst example, but it's a well-known example. So that's why I gave it. And the other point which I was making was that, in fact, that's one of the longer chapters in my book as to why you should not try to follow the strategies of so-called successful investors, because A, they may not have been as successful as you think, but more importantly, it's the wrong question to ask. You start with that this person has made a lot of money and what's the strategy they followed. The question you have to ask is, of all the people who followed this strategy, what happened to them? Because you can have a very high risk strategy where every year 90% of the people go bankrupt, but the 10% make their money 10 times. You play that game 5 times, 99% have gone bankrupt, but that one person has made out like a bandit. And you said, wow, this was the most successful investor in history. So
my follow-up question is actually something to do with your life. Okay? And what I've seen, because you try to be an outlier even in the world of finance, like you said, mathematics, statistics, English person, duking it out. In IIMA, one of 14 women in your batch, my batch had 12, and you were the gold medalist, one of only 2 to make it, And secondly, you were also a gold medalist in Lucknow. And one of the things I read in an interview that you said was, that you kind of attributed certain things to your Pathan roots, and you said, you were always somebody who really didn't have a benchmark, because you said, I don't have a benchmark. I set my own benchmark. I really don't have anybody that I look up to or look at. Okay. In some way, this Ekla Chalo Re kind of thing, how has it really helped you in forging your own path in this kind of a very tricky field?
So, it is just that many of these things you see only in hindsight, but to me it was always that the benchmark was that am I doing my best? It was not that whether I'm doing better than XYZ, but am I doing my best, which at one level seems like too low a benchmark, but if you really go into it, that's the highest benchmark there is, that I should not regret that I didn't try hard enough. Like when I went to the university, people said, do you think you'll top? I said, I have no idea how the other people are. And maybe if you're looking over your shoulder, you won't even reach that high. So, like in my BA, I got 88%, the next highest was 78%. So if I was benchmarking, the gap may not have been that high. But to me, again, as I said, it was that, and I also attribute it to one of my school teachers, and she was what is called a very strict marker. So she would cut marks for every single maths teacher. That if you missed a step, of course, but even if you wrote the step, but you didn't write this implies that. And just that training made me that I can't leave a gap. I have to, nobody should be able to find fault with what I'm doing. So that became the training. But it is, as I said, that's the way I was built. And you talked about the Pathan route. So my parents were both born in Peshawar. So my father always used to say that I'm a Pathan, and whatever I say, I will do, and all that. And some of the things I used to laugh at him in a sense, the way children laugh at their parents, that he doesn't really care about what anyone thinks of him, and he does what he thinks is right. In fact, I met a documentary maker who had made a documentary on Pathans, and when she told me these are the characters that you just described my father, but I found that some of it has rubbed off on me, because that also doesn't occur to me very often, that has anyone done it before or what anyone else will think of it. I just think that, is this the right thing to do? Can I do a good job of it? And so tell me the logical reason why this. So it's both that first principles thinking also, like for everything. Like when I was growing up, when I was 10, 11, I said, why do women change their names after marriage? Explain to me the logical reason why this should work. And it didn't work for me. So I told my parents that I'm not going to change my name. So they were okay with it. They never stopped me from having opinions. But many things also, I think partly it was also that I didn't have friends from class 1 to class 5. So I was always the youngest in my batch. And when you are very young, like in class 1, you are 4.5 and your Others are 6 plus, like it's almost a 50% gap. So, and plus then you are doing well in studies, so you are too different, and children don't know how to interact with somebody that different, so nobody would talk to me in school. And by the time you are in class 5 or so, the percentage difference is not so much, so I started to make friends. But those 3-4 years you're sitting alone in the recess and all that, so maybe that also, the pop psychology wise, it also trained you to think for yourself. You are not thinking of whether this is acceptable to the group or not because you don't have a group. So maybe that also was part of the story.
That brings us to the next question. Are you a natural contrarian in what you do, or how do you apply this bent in your investing? Because there have been many instances where your views have diverged significantly from the popular market opinion, and you are never shunned. And even now, I think your view is quite apart from what the market consensus seems to be.
Right.
Is this something that you started developing after you became a professional in this field, or it's just something that's grown with you?
So it is not that you should not be a contrarian for the sake of being a contrarian. And so therefore, I mean, it's no great virtue to saying everything just opposite to what everyone is saying. It is just that whatever your analysis or system is, if the result is different from what everyone is saying, I never shied away from saying it. I didn't mind being in a minority of one. And, one of the most famous cases of that is Amazon. So Amazon was a much loved stock on Wall Street, and then the tech crash of 2000 happened, and all the people on Wall Street who were very positive on Amazon up until then suddenly turned very negative. And there were even cover stories in magazines like Business Week saying that is Amazon going bankrupt. And we had not just a buy, we had a strong buy on the company. And that came out of pure analysis, because for the first time, so I don't know what Wall Street was looking at, because, we just looked at, that was the first time, the last quarter of 2000, when Amazon had made a great deal of cash flow, something like $220 or $240 million. We talked to the company, we said, we don't want any other statement, just tell us if the calculation is correct, you've made that much cash flow. They said yes. So we thought it was a great time to buy the stock, but we were so much in a minority that Jeff Bezos sent us an email saying thank you for the support, because there's no other buy on the street. So that was the only thing. It is not, and as I said, we were willing to say that the Bank of England numbers would not come out to be right. So that's all. That if your analysis shows something that is different from the industry. See, the other thing is that the industry sits in consensus. There's a very strong incentive for every analyst to say what everyone else is saying, because it is okay if you are wrong along with everyone else. If you are wrong alone, then you have a problem. No, that's why, for example, S&P projections for the year, I have never given any index projection ever, whether in Diwali or in January, because that is something, as I got the term only 2 years ago, but I have never given it, which Daniel Kahneman calls it objective ignorance, things which you not only don't know, but you cannot know. But coming back to how Wall Street, for example, gives projections on the S&P 500, every year the cluster is between 0 to 10%, because that's a safe place to be, and everyone else is there. In 100 years, how many times has S&P moved between 0 to 10%? 14 times. So, it is that those projections are not worth the paper they are written on, but there's comfort to being with the crowd.
What happens in that rare instance where you are wrong? How do you deal with that? So, in
fact, it will not be a rare instance, because in the markets, you will not be, even the greatest investor or fund manager in the world is not right, let alone 100, even 80% of the time. 60, 65% is a great hit rate. So you have to remember, and because, as I said, I was hiring freshers, the most difficult lesson to teach freshers is that all your education system is one question, one specific and right answer. Whereas this is a game of luck and skill. It is a game of probability. You do not know the future. So you are going to, in fact, I have a short video saying the best thing you can do for your portfolio is that every time you're taking a decision, tell yourself that you may be wrong. because a significant portion of your decisions are going to be wrong. I mean, Warren Buffett has this reputation of never selling. He sells 85% of what he buys within 2 years, 50% within 6 months. So, that's the game. It is not a game of getting it exactly right. And one of the things also is that your definition of mistake changes. So the mistake part is, was your decision-making process wrong? And sometimes you will make a lot of money on a decision that was wrong. So you must be cognizant of that this was pure luck. I mean, one of the biggest chunks of money I made in my life was on a totally wrong decision. I put too much money in one company, it really tanked, and there were certain lock-ins it could not sell. And then it went up 50 times for some other reasons, which you could not have foreseen. So, I mean, it made a lot of money, but the decision was still wrong. And sometimes a low probability event happens. So but you have to have that objectivity that, see, when your portfolio does well, we all think we are geniuses. When it goes down, then we have a lot of luck factors to blame. Luck, or, somebody did a wrong thing, the company, the operator, or this or that. But in the up move also there is luck. So don't forget that.
There are two sides to luck. One is you recognize it is luck. And the second, you deal with it. How do you do both? How do you recognize that this was luck? Like you're just telling about an investment which you thought was a wrong investment, and you still think it's a wrong investment even after it goes 50 times.
Yeah.
So how do you recognize it is luck, and how do you deal with it? Because a lot of people have difficulty dealing with the greatest luck in their life because at that time they believe it is skill.
That's what I'm saying. So this is also a bias called attribution bias. That if you go for an interview, you get the job, then you were very good, your education was good, and your interview was good. If you don't get the job, then there was some hanky panky going on. So that is it is hard coded within us. And I think the reason the evolution did it, that you don't give up, you still keep trying. So it's again hard coded. So you have to, but in everything there are both these truths.
I just want to ask you, I find, because I've dealt with a lot of people, I've also had the same relationship with money. It gets very emotional for most of us. And a lot of people don't know, in many times, why they're earning money, what money they have. And the latest book by Houssel is, The Art of Spending Money itself. Mm-hmm. How exactly should people make sense of money? Question 1. Question 2, what does money mean personally to you?
So, how to make sense of money? I mean, it is investing or any of this is not as simple nor as complex as people make it out to be. So, you do not need to be a professional level investor that I need to know how to get the multi-baggers. No need for that. And because of that, some people freeze. So they are at two ends of the risk spectrum. So either they are all FD and PF, or they want to become day traders, and both of those are wrong. So, I mean, you just do a sensible asset allocation and continue with that. That's 85%, 90% of the way through. You don't need to optimize for the last 10%. If it's a young person, I tell them start saving early. And therefore, you will need to save less every month than if you start 5 years later. So those are just do the boring basics. I say that it's been my long-held belief that a lot of people are in equity markets for entertainment value. That if I say that I'm doing only this boring thing, what am I going to talk about in parties when my friends say that? So don't fall into that trap. In terms of, money is something good to have, and the input and output in my business is money. But the real thrill for me, of course, comes from learning. I mean, till date, that's the thing that gives me most joy. But money is important, at least up to a point. That is definitely, like in the US, they've done these happiness versus money studies. So up to about $70,000 income every annum, per annum, it adds to your happiness. Beyond that, it just tapers off. Then, so you need a certain minimum to live a good life. But beyond that, the money doesn't add to happiness. So,
You're actually making me remember one of Martina Navratilova's famous quotes. This journalist asked her, Martina, you made a lot of money, but money doesn't buy happiness. But she said yes, but it makes misery more enjoyable. So I think a lot of us don't mind living in enjoyable misery. So, okay, I think we'll ask the group captain if there are some quick questions from the audience
Okay.
before we jump back to other things. Yeah, what early mindset or habit from your time at Lucknow University most prepared you for leadership in Wall Street linked global markets? It's a question from Hari.
I don't think, you are thinking that far ahead. As I said, I mean, even the profession didn't exist even when I graduated from MBA. So it's not as if that you had some grand plan. But as I said, first principles thinking, the love for learning and the love for doing my best, that looking back, those patterns were there even early on. So that would be what being honest in what you do. And that integrity, for example, English was not a scoring subject, but I took it because I wanted to take it. Or even in IIM in the second year, I did not choose subjects according to how scoring they were. So it is good to have the gold medals. I won't say no. I mean, even now, I meet somebody who's grown up in Lucknow and they will say, oh, you are the girl who got 7 gold medals from Rajiv Gandhi. And, so it feels good, but it should not inform your choices. So your choices should be as honest as you can make them to be.
Okay, this is from a lady, and one observation, even in this group of about 110, there are about 22 women in this audience. It started off only with 12, added another 10 later. So one is the absence still of women in money, especially understanding of money. But more importantly, this young lady, I think, is asking for young leaders and entrepreneurs who want to build careers and organizations that outlast cycles. What one leadership principle should they commit to early and never compromise on?
I would think integrity, both in terms of outside ethics as well as, what really matters to you. That, I remember a time in Citibank, I was still very, very new, I think it probably 2 years. And I was in merchant banking, and at that time, this is pre-SEBI days, so there was this regulation that if a company is coming with an IPO and they don't have a loan, so the project has not been appraised by a lending institution, then the merchant banker should do an appraisal of the project. So there was this company back then called Usha Rectifiers. So they were coming out with an issue, and they were like, this is, you're laughing in hindsight, but that they were like, so there were like these 5-6 projects that they had, and now this is my merchant banking head, so several levels above me, and he was a good friend of the promoter also. So he had called me and asked me to do an appraisal. So I went to Delhi and I did this. I went around, met the Bharat Electronics people and all that, because there's some picture tubes and some other electronic items. And I came back and I said that I don't think it makes sense. And he said, I still remember the words, he said, you want to write essays or you want to do deals? I said, I'm not putting my signature as a professional and asking people to invest in something where I do not think, it makes sense for them. So they were like this big fight. I said, next year's increment, bonus, whatever he wants to do, he can do. But I will, as a professional, I will not do this. So that's the kind of, that is, because, integrity is always a slippery slope. Nobody starts out thinking that they'll go to jail or they'll bring down a whole institution. A 30-year-old trader has brought down a 200-year-old bank. Everybody thinks that it is just a small thing and next month I will make it up and I will put the money back. But it never works that way. So don't take the first step.
It's a somewhat pregnant kind of a situation. So,
and just, since I don't know whether the question specifically asked was that or not, but I would like to see a lot more women managing their own money. This is a cause for me. I use every platform I get to do that. Recently I was at this Business Today Most Powerful Women Awards, and I looked at the gathering and I said, these are the most powerful women in India, and I can tell you more than half are not managing their own money. And you could see from the faces that that was true. So, please spread the word to all women that they should manage their own money. There's no independence without that.
I'm so happy that you said that. That's why I brought up this aspect about the lack of women,
Yeah.
especially in managing money. Now there's a very specific question about the use of AI ML in all kinds of financial instruments. And are these AI ML models, you have a human in the middle concept, but he's talking about the human irrationality. And do these models fail to capture those kinds of issues?
So, I mean, as I said, we think there is still human intervention required because not everything the AI can capture. Like, for example, geopolitical events or COVID or something like that, that call the AI cannot make. So there's still that aspect. But human irrationality is not what you are trying to target through that. That's like... that's what you're trying to get over by putting the AI ML system in place, is that to get rid of the human irrationality. Well, I'm not in the trading business. I'm not trading options. I mean, options also we use, but I'm not doing anything which requires even looking at the market every day. So it's like our cycle is normally a full rebalance once a quarter. We might make some changes during the period.
Okay, if Devina was a 20-year-old now, what is the advice that she would give to herself on using AI to start investments without risking money?
So you can do a dry run and see how it goes. But in real markets, see, for example, you should always have a stop loss. So on the risk management side, we say on the buying side, it is human plus machine. But on the risk management side, it is machine only, because human being will always try to override that and say this time it is different. So you can always try out your systems without risking the money before actually risking the money. Okay. But again, don't try trading. Don't try to be a day trader or something. That's never a sensible idea for almost everybody.
Okay, just to add to that, if today's Devina were to go back in time and, tell little Devina from Lucknow or an equivalent, what is the kind of things that you would tell that little Devina, based on what you have learned from life with respect to work, with respect to money, with respect to anything else?
Well, I could have started investing earlier than I did, but then I started working at 21. So, just a few years gap didn't matter much. The other thing is to be a little more assertive, because the fact is that till now, women are talked over at all levels. Even if you are a US Supreme Court justice, the woman will be interrupted more. Indra Nooyi says the same thing, that in the Pepsi boardroom, it was the same story. So earlier I would cede the floor. Now I kind of say that, let me finish, But normally when anybody asks me this question, that what would you tell a younger you? I say that in general, you should flip the question and say that what would a younger you think of you? That did you achieve or go towards the goals and dreams you had? And I say this especially to women, because too many women give up on their dreams somewhere along the way. And even as a child, I used to always wonder that many times women around me would say that my ambitions are for my husband and my children. And I used to think that if this happens in every generation, when will the girls achieve their dreams? There is too much pressure often on women to give up on their dreams. So that's the part I would say the younger, what would a younger you think of you?
There are a lot of people today who think that making money in equity in India is very easy, and that making 18-20% compounded.
I think after last year, fewer people would be thinking that. 2024 is when everybody thought that 30% compounding was there for the taking.
Not come below 18. So what are your thoughts on the people setting return expectations for the future? I think that will be a good last question for me. How do you think people should actually calibrate their return expectations?
So the long-term returns from Indian markets have been in the range of 15-16%. But I mean, assets started with that, but the actual fact is that the decade to decade, the variation has been very high. I mean, I am not of the same view as Ramesh Damani on this, that if you look at the 80s, the compounding was 21%. The next decade, it was 14%. Then it was 17. Then the 2010 to 20, it was not even 9%. It was the same as FD, about 8.7, 8.8%. So that's the kind of deviation in equity returns. So equity returns are not predictable for even sometimes 7-8 years. I mean, 94 to 2003, net return was zero. The market went up and then it came down, the net return was zero. So the superpower actually in the markets is the ability to live through that. I mean, there was a book on Rakesh Jhunjhunwala, and the only one line I thought was the real crux of that book, not his stock picking. I mean, he used to pick all kinds of stocks, but he said that I made a lot of money from 89 to 92, 2003 to 2007, and 2009 to 11. In between, there were even 5 years where I made no money. I said, this was his superpower, to know that there will be periods, long periods when you won't make money, and then suddenly in 2 years, you will make 5 years return. And that is the most difficult discipline to have. So it is not that, you have to be the greatest stock picker. It is to understand that this is the variation. So in 2024, there were a lot of people who thought that 30% was there. I mean, not just I'm talking small investors. Family offices would come to me and say that my expectations are not unrealistic. I'll be happy with 30% compounding. I said, that is unrealistic. I mean, my RMs would come and tell me that so-and-so is telling me ki your ma'am sounds very good, but she talks like Mother Teresa. You must launch a small cap scheme. Why are you saying be conservative when, this is not the time. So I'll just give that. These are very technical questions. I'm not sure I want to take that. I'd rather ask you your symbol or your logo is the hair. I just want to understand why you chose that hair. You explained it a little bit, but I just want to understand because there seems to be a very deeper symbolism behind the choice of the hair. I was looking for a mascot, and the hair actually has a lot of qualities that are sort of aspirational for investors. One, it runs very fast, but it can change direction equally fast. So that's one good thing. And it has a nearly 360-degree vision, which you aspire to. So those were the two big characteristics of the hair that made sense. That because you should, one thing is certain in markets that themes change, whether it's asset classes, whether it's countries, whether it is, sectors within a country, everything changes. And one thing which we haven't spoken about, but I would like to leave that message also because that's the biggest gap in most Indians' portfolios, which is that global diversification. Because when I started working, the dollar was 12 rupees. Since we are talking the journey, there's been a 90% depreciation in the course of less than a career. So when you're budgeting for anything 10 years, 20 years, 30 years later, you can't forget that. Besides the fact of not putting all your eggs in one basket, which is where my globalization journey started in 99. So those things, that's the biggest gap. And because it's a cause for me, we have a all geography, all asset product that starts at $10,000, which now is 9 lakh rupees. Not very long back, it was 7.5 lakh rupees. So that again gives you a benchmark. If anybody was planning to send their children to Europe to study in 2025 alone, the college fees has gone up 20%. In rupee has depreciated against the euro by 20%. So that's what you're dealing with.
Part of your scars.
Yeah, single country, single currency, single asset risk is what you should not have.
Okay, the last question, because it's very useful for a lot of young people out here. For young people from small towns or non-finance backgrounds in India, what inspiring advice from your Lucknow to Wall Street story would you like to give?
Don't look for shortcuts. Don't think that you will become a day trader because you said small towns. Actually, the smaller the place, the more people lose. That's the less education, less income. Everywhere the losses are more. So don't look for shortcuts. If you want to do this, then do a thorough job of learning about it and then doing it. It doesn't matter where you come from.